Vanessa Cole had spent her entire career upholding the law with unwavering integrity. From her early days as a young, ambitious attorney to becoming one of the most respected judges in the city, she had dedicated her life to justice. She had fought against corruption, stood firm in the face of intimidation, and ensured that the law served all people fairly. But on this particular evening, as she drove home after a long day in court, she was about to experience firsthand the very injustice she had spent years trying to dismantle. The city lights blurred against the windshield as she maneuvered through the quiet streets. The exhaustion of the day weighed on her, but there was also a sense of satisfaction. She had presided over a difficult case, ensuring fairness despite the pressure from powerful interests. Moments like these reminded her why she had chosen this path. But then, flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. At first, she wasn't alarmed. Traffic stops were routine. She had done nothing wrong. Still, she signaled and pulled over, rolling down her window as the officer approached. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his buzz-cut hair barely visible under his cap. His badge read Officer Brad Miller, but it was the look in his eyes that caught her attention. Cold, piercing, and filled with something far worse than authority. "License and registration," he barked, not bothering with pleasantries. Vanessa remained composed, reaching into her purse and retrieving the necessary documents. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I was stopped?" she inquired, keeping her tone even. Brad barely glanced at her ID. His gaze remained locked on her face, suspicion written all over his expression. "This car doesn't look like it belongs to you," he said flatly. Her brows furrowed. "Excuse me? Step out of the vehicle." His hand rested on his holster. A chill ran through her, but she knew better than to escalate the situation. She had seen too many cases where things spiraled out of control because of an officer's preconceived notions. Vanessa exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "Officer, this is my car. If you check the registration, you'll see—" "I said step out of the car," he interrupted, voice sharp with authority. She hesitated, the absurdity of the situation making her pulse race. Complying was the safest option, even if it burned. She slowly opened the door and stepped out, standing tall despite the humiliation. Brad snatched her ID again, looking at it as if expecting to find something incriminating. His lips curled in disdain. "Vanessa Cole, never heard of you." "You should have," she said evenly. "I work in the courthouse." Brad scoffed. "Yeah? As a clerk?" "As a judge," she corrected, unwavering. For a moment, there was hesitation. A flicker of something that might have been doubt crossed his face, but arrogance quickly replaced it. He had already made up his mind about her. "Right," he said mockingly. "And I'm the mayor. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Her heart pounded. "You can't be serious. I have done nothing wrong." "Stop resisting," he suddenly shouted as if performing for an unseen audience. Before she could react, he grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back with unnecessary force. Pain shot through her shoulder as the cold steel of the handcuffs locked around her wrists. "You're under arrest for resisting a lawful order," he declared. The absurdity of it nearly made her laugh. But there was nothing funny about being a black woman in handcuffs at the mercy of a racist cop. As she was shoved into the back of the squad car, her mind raced. She had fought against this kind of abuse for years, but now she was the one sitting in the cage. Through the window, she stared straight ahead, refusing to let them see her break. Brad Miller would regret this. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Vanessa's wrists as she sat in the back of the police cruiser, her mind racing. The stale scent of sweat and old fabric clung to the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of fear she refused to acknowledge. The injustice of the situation was infuriating, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had spent years presiding over cases just like this, hearing stories of power-hungry officers who abused their authority. She had ruled on cases involving false arrests, police brutality, and racial profiling, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined she would be sitting in the back of a squad car, a victim of the very system she had dedicated her life to holding accountable. The car jolted forward as Officer Brad Miller pulled back onto the road. Through the metal screen separating them, Vanessa could see the way his knuckles tightened around the steering wheel. His jaw clenched with smug satisfaction. He thought he had won. You should have just kept your mouth shut, he muttered, barely glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Vanessa remained silent, staring out of the window as streetlights streaked past in blurred lines of gold and white. Engaging with him now wouldn't help. It would only fuel whatever sick pleasure he was getting from this abuse of power. Instead, she focused on her breathing, counting each inhale and exhale to keep her anger in check. She had rights. She knew that. But she also knew that in situations like these, knowing your rights wasn't always enough. The wrong move, the wrong word, the wrong look could turn a bad situation deadly. So she kept quiet, waiting for her chance to act. The drive seemed longer than it should have been. She knew exactly where the nearest precinct was, but the route Miller took felt deliberate, winding through back streets, as if he wanted to make her stew in silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car pulled up in front of the station. The bright fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows against the brick exterior. Miller stepped out first, slamming the door behind him. A moment later, her door swung open. He reached in, grabbing her arm with unnecessary force, yanking her out onto the pavement. Vanessa stumbled, but quickly regained her footing, refusing to let him see any weakness. "Let's go," he ordered, tightening his grip as he led her up the concrete steps. Inside, the station buzzed with activity. Officers at their desks, phones ringing, the low murmur of voices filling the air. Some looked up as Miller escorted her in, their expressions unreadable. Others barely spared her a glance, too wrapped up in their own work to care. At the booking desk, a tired-looking officer glanced at Miller. "What's this?" "Caught her resisting," Miller said with a smirk, shoving Vanessa forward. The officer raised an eyebrow as he picked up her ID from the counter. His eyes flickered over her name, then back up to her face. A flicker of recognition crossed his features, and for the first time since the arrest, Vanessa saw a crack in their confidence. "Judge Cole?" His tone shifted, uncertainty creeping in. "That's right," Vanessa said, keeping her voice even. "And I expect a phone call." Miller's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, another officer stepped in, a black woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Sergeant Lillian Carter. Vanessa had seen her in court before, known her by reputation. Unlike Miller, she was respected. "Vanessa Cole?" Carter's gaze swept over the scene, then landed on Miller. "What the hell is going on here?" Miller straightened, defensive. "She was acting suspicious, gave me attitude, refused to comply." Carter's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" Vanessa met her gaze. "I was pulled over without cause, asked for my registration, and then arrested when I complied. He never even checked my information." Silence stretched between them. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line before she turned to the booking officer. "Uncuff her." Miller's face reddened. "Wait a minute." "That was an order," Carter snapped. The booking officer hesitated for only a second before nodding and stepping forward, unlocking the cuffs. Vanessa exhaled as the metal restraints fell away, rubbing her sore wrists. Carter turned back to Miller. "Take her prints off the system and get her personal effects back. Now." Miller's jaw twitched, but he nodded stiffly before stalking off, his arrogance cracking under the weight of his mistake. Vanessa rolled her shoulders, ignoring the sting of her wrists as she looked at Carter. "Thank you." Carter nodded. "You shouldn't have been here in the first place." She paused, then added, "Are you planning to file a complaint?" Vanessa met her gaze, considering. Then she straightened. "Oh, I'm planning to do a lot more than that." Vanessa sat in the dimly lit living room of her apartment, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The soft hum of the city outside her window was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her mind. The events of the night played over and over, each moment fueling her frustration, her anger, her determination. She had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom, believing in the power of the law, only to find herself on the receiving end of its failures. Her wrists still ached from the handcuffs, the faint red marks a reminder of how easily power could be abused. She had always known the system was flawed. She had seen it firsthand in the cases brought before her. But experiencing it, feeling the weight of unjustified authority pressing down on her, was something entirely different. She took a slow sip of tea, the warmth doing little to soothe the chill in her bones. This couldn't go unanswered. It wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had been pulled over for nothing, who had been harassed, mistreated, arrested without cause. How many of them never got the chance to walk free? How many had their lives derailed by officers like Brad Miller, who saw power as a weapon rather than a responsibility? Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking through her thoughts. She reached for it, her pulse quickening when she saw the caller ID. Vanessa. A familiar voice greeted her when she answered. I just heard what happened. Are you okay? It was David Harrison, an old friend and one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the city. If there was anyone she could trust to help her navigate this, it was him. I'm fine, she said, though she wasn't sure how true that was. But this can't be ignored, David. He needs to be held accountable. There was a pause on the other end, then a sigh. You know how these things go. Internal Affairs will do a so-called investigation, slap him on the wrist at best, and then he'll be back on the streets like nothing ever happened. Vanessa's grip on the phone tightened. Not this time. David was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. Then we need to be strategic. Going after a cop, especially one protected by the system, isn't easy. But if we can prove a pattern, if there are other complaints like other victims, we might have a case strong enough to force action. Vanessa's mind was already working, considering every legal angle, every possible strategy. I want to file a formal complaint first thing in the morning, and I want to know everything about Miller, his record, his history, any past accusations. There has to be something. I'll see what I can dig up, David promised. And Vanessa, be careful. You know what happens when people go up against the system. She knew. She had seen it. Whistleblowers silenced, victims discredited, stories twisted until the truth was buried beneath bureaucracy and politics. But she had spent too many years fighting for justice to back down now. Thanks, David, she said. I'll call you in the morning. After hanging up, she sat for a moment, staring at the city lights flickering beyond her window. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, eyes sharp with resolve. She picked up her laptop and began searching. If Miller had done this to her, he had done it to others, and she was going to find them. For hours, she combed through news articles, legal databases, public records, anything she could find. There were small mentions of complaints buried deep in reports, but nothing that had ever led to real consequences. A few excessive force allegations, a couple of questionable stops, but no formal disciplinary action. Frustration gnawed at her. The system was built to protect officers like him, to sweep their misconduct under the rug unless someone with enough power and persistence forced it into the light. Then she found something. A name. Marcus Reed, a young black man who had filed a complaint against Miller 2 years ago for unlawful arrest and excessive force. His case had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Vanessa's heartbeat quickened. This was exactly what she needed. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and dialed David again. I found something, she said the moment he answered. Marcus Reed. He filed a complaint against Miller 2 years ago. David exhaled. That's good. That means there's a pattern. If we can get him to talk... I'm going to talk to him, Vanessa interrupted. David hesitated. Are you sure that's a good idea? He needs to know he's not alone, she said firmly, and I need to hear his story. Another pause. Then David relented. All right, but keep me updated. She ended the call and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The fight was just beginning. But for the first time since she had been thrown into the back of that police car, she felt a sense of control. Miller had thought he could silence her. He was wrong. Vanessa sat in her car outside a small apartment complex on the south side of the city, her fingers tapping anxiously against the steering wheel. She had tracked down Marcus Reed's last known address, a modest brick building with a rusted fire escape running up the side. The street was quiet, the occasional sound of a passing car breaking the stillness of the evening. She had debated calling first, but something told her this was the kind of conversation that needed to happen face to face. People who had been through what Marcus had didn't always trust phone calls. They needed to look you in the eye, to know you were real, that you weren't just another person making empty promises. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and approached the entrance. The smell of damp pavement and distant cooking filled the air. She found his apartment number on the mailboxes and climbed the worn stairs to the second floor. When she reached his door, she hesitated only a second before knocking. There was a long pause. She could hear movement inside, the faint rustle of someone shifting behind the door. Another pause. Then, the door cracked open, a security chain still latched in place. A young man with tired eyes and a wary expression peered through the gap. "Marcus Reed?" Vanessa asked, keeping her voice calm and steady. "Who's asking?" His tone was cautious, edged with suspicion. "My name is Vanessa Carter. I'm an attorney." She pulled out her business card and held it up, hoping it would ease his concern. "I need to talk to you about Officer Brad Miller." The mention of the name made Marcus tense. His grip on the door tightened, and for a moment she thought he might slam it shut. Instead, he exhaled sharply and undid the chain, opening the door just enough for her to step inside. The apartment was small but neat. A couch with worn cushions sat against one wall, a TV flickering with muted images from a sports channel. A stack of unopened mail rested on the counter. The air carried the faint scent of coffee and something fried. Marcus folded his arms as he leaned against the kitchen counter, his eyes studying her carefully. "Why are you here?" Vanessa met his gaze. "Because what happened to you shouldn't have been ignored, and because it just happened to me." His brow furrowed slightly, his guard still up. "Miller?" She nodded. "Pulled me over for nothing. Took me in on bogus charges. He wanted to make a point." Marcus let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Sounds familiar." "That's why I need to talk to you," Vanessa pressed. "I'm filing a formal complaint, but that alone won't be enough. If we can show a pattern, if we can prove he's done this to multiple people, we have a real case." Marcus's expression darkened, and he turned away, running a hand over his head. "I already tried," he muttered. "Filed my complaint, told them everything. You know what they did? Nothing, just buried it. Told me I didn't have enough evidence. Like my bruises weren't enough." Vanessa felt anger tighten in her chest. This was exactly what she had feared. The system protecting its own, making sure the truth never saw the light of day. "I know," she said softly, "and that's why we have to try again. Together." Marcus let out a long breath, his shoulders tense. "And what if it doesn't work? What if he walks away like he always does?" Vanessa took a step closer. "Then at least we made noise. At least we didn't let him keep doing this in silence. But I think we have a real chance. I've already started looking into his record. If we find more people, if we build this right, we can make sure he doesn't get away with it this time." Marcus was quiet for a long time. His eyes flickered with doubt, with anger, with something deeper, something raw. He had been through this before. He had put himself out there, and it led nowhere. But Vanessa could see the part of him that still wanted justice, the part that still hoped. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said, "I'll talk." Relief flooded through Vanessa. She pulled out her phone and hit the record button. "Tell me everything." And Marcus did. He told her about the night Miller pulled him over, how it had started with an accusation that he ran a stop sign, one he hadn't seen, one that might not have even existed. How Miller had made him step out of the car, searched him without cause, and then slammed him against the hood when he asked why. He described the way Miller tightened the cuffs too hard, how he had laughed when Marcus winced in pain. "He took me in for resisting arrest," Marcus said bitterly, "even though I didn't do a damn thing. Spent the night in a cell, got out the next morning with charges that just disappeared like magic." He shook his head. "They just wanted to make sure I knew my place." Vanessa's stomach churned. His story was eerily similar to hers. "This is exactly what we need," she said. "Your voice, your experience. If we find others like you, we can put real pressure on them." Marcus exhaled and nodded. "Okay, I'll help, but only if you promise me something. Anything. Promise me we won't let him get away with it this time." Vanessa met his gaze, her jaw set with determination. "I promise." Vanessa sat in her office late into the night, sifting through documents, case files, and old complaints against Officer Brad Miller. The dim desk lamp cast a soft glow on the growing pile of evidence, but it still didn't feel like enough. She had Marcus's statement, and she had her own experience, but she needed more. More voices, more proof, more undeniable truth. She had already reached out to local activists, a few community organizers, and even a couple of journalists who had written about police misconduct before. If they could bring enough attention to this case, maybe they could finally force the department to take action. A knock at the door startled her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the clock, just past midnight. Cautiously, she stood and walked over to the door, peering through the peephole. Marcus. She exhaled in relief and opened the door. "You're still working?" he asked, stepping inside and glancing at the mountain of papers on her desk. "Of course," she said. "We don't have time to waste." He nodded and pulled out his phone. "I've been talking to some people. A guy named Terrence reached out. Says Miller did the same thing to him last year. He wants to talk." Vanessa's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what we need. When can we meet him?" "Tomorrow morning," Marcus said. "He wants to do it in person." Vanessa grabbed a notebook, jotting down a reminder. Every new voice, every new statement added weight to their case. She felt a flicker of hope, but it was fragile, hanging by a thread. "Marcus," she said, looking up, "are you sure you want to do this? I mean, really sure? This could get ugly." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm tired, Vanessa. Tired of pretending this stuff doesn't happen. Tired of being afraid. If speaking up helps stop him, then yeah, I'm sure." She nodded, understanding his exhaustion. It was the same exhaustion she felt, the weight of a broken system pressing down on them both. The next morning, they met Terrence at a small diner just outside the city. He was in his late 20s, tall and lean, with wary eyes that darted around the room as if expecting someone to be watching. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, then looked up at Vanessa. "You're really going after him?" he asked. "Yes," she said firmly, "and we need your help." Terrence took a deep breath. "All right, here's what happened to me." His story mirrored Marcus's almost exactly. A minor traffic stop, an accusation he couldn't prove wrong, an arrest that left him bruised and humiliated, the same playbook, the same abuse of power. As he spoke, Vanessa recorded every word, her determination growing stronger. Over the next few days, more people came forward. Each new story painted a clearer picture. This wasn't an isolated incident. Miller had a pattern, a method, and a disturbing history of targeting people who wouldn't be believed. With statements piling up, Vanessa prepared to file an official civil rights lawsuit. But just as she was ready to move forward, she received an unexpected call. "Vanessa Carter?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "Yes, who's this?" "My name's Detective Raymond Harris. I think we need to talk." Her pulse quickened. "About what?" "Officer Miller," the detective said. "I think I have something you'll want to see." They met in an empty parking lot that night. Detective Harris was a tall, broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and a cautious demeanor. He handed her a folder. "I shouldn't even be giving you this," he said, "but if you're serious about bringing him down, you'll need it." Vanessa flipped through the documents. Internal complaints, disciplinary reports, even a partially redacted memo suggesting Miller had been investigated before, but nothing had ever come of it. The system had protected him. "This proves they knew," she said, her voice tight with anger. Harris nodded. "They always know." The final piece of the puzzle was in her hands. With this, they had everything they needed to expose Miller, to demand action, to finally bring him down. A week later, Vanessa stood at a press conference, surrounded by Marcus, Terrence, and others who had come forward. She laid out the evidence, the testimonies, and the department's history of covering for Miller. The city couldn't ignore it anymore. Within days, Miller was suspended. Then, under mounting pressure, he was fired. Criminal charges followed. The system had tried to protect him, but this time it hadn't been enough. As Vanessa watched the news report, she turned to Marcus. "We did it," she said. He exhaled, a look of relief washing over his face. "Yeah," he said, "we did." For the first time in a long time, Vanessa felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before,